Hey, people, thank you. Thank you for coming on a perfectly fine moonlit Tuesday evening to listen to economics. Oh my God. There is a bar right across the hall, people. There is a hot tub over there. There's a beautiful lake you could walk down. And here you are listening to The Economist. It sounds like a Stephen King novel, doesn't it? Just when you thought it was safe to go back to Harrison Hot Springs, along came The Economist. And actually, I should warn you, they say an economist is someone who's good with numbers but didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So, yeah. So in light of that, that's kind of the safe harbor warning. You know, you get those ads for the RRSPs on TV, and then some guy comes on at the end and says, past performance is no guarantee of future returns, blah, 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 blah. Beware. Okay, so that was my safe harbor warning, and if you still want to go to the bar, I won't take any offense whatsoever. But thank you. I'm a great believer in economic knowledge and economic literacy and economics from the workers' side of the tracks, if you like. Because so all too often around economics, we're told by the experts who stand up, experts who work for banks and work for the Chamber of Commerce and work for corporate-funded business schools at universities, to tell us what's good for us and why we have to tighten our belts. And that's just how it is. It's the laws of nature, it's supply and demand, et cetera, et cetera. Trying to pretend that it's all natural, it's technical, it's mathematical, it's scientific, but it isn't. It's very ideological. Economics is a very ideological subject, and that's why the labor movement has to have its own vision and its own narrative and its own knowledge on economics. So throughout my whole career as a union economist, right, which sounds, you know, to some people it sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? What do you mean union economist? Unions are there to fuck up the economy. How can you have an economist? What are you talking about? It's like military intelligence or progressive conservative, dare I say. Not many of those left, but anyways. But I think unions have to. Well, first of all, unions are the economy. There's no doubt about it. Working people drag their asses out of bed in the morning and go off and do their job. They use their brains and their brawn. They produce real value added. Any individual worker produces more real value added on their job, no matter how humble it is, than the fat cat on Bay Street who did nothing other than throw darts at a dartboard to pick which stocks to buy, okay? There's no value added in that. They didn't actually do anything useful. They creamed some of the surplus in the course of their dart throwing, but other than that, they didn't produce anything of value. So working people are the economy. Without work, the economy would be nothing. Absolutely. The economy literally is the sum total of our work. That's what the economy is. So workers and workers' unions have to have a narrative about the economy, and that's why I'm grateful that you people took a whole perfectly fine Tuesday evening to come and learn a bit about economics. So thank you. Thank you for what you're doing, and give yourselves a round of applause for that. Okay. So I'm going to dive in and talk a little bit about where the economy is right now, the trouble that we're in, and you know that we are. Our members are struggling to pay the bills, to put food on the table, to hope that their job is secure. We got storm clouds ahead. We got economic storm clouds, of course, that I'll talk about. We got political storm clouds. I see Trump has won another primary tonight, and Polyev is on a rampage. And man, do we have to have our big rubber boots on for the year or two ahead. We are in some big challenges, and having a good understanding of the economy and who's to blame for it, because it isn't us, it isn't workers who created this mess. Workers are the victims of this mess, and we refuse to be collateral damage in somebody else's narrative. We have to have our own narrative. So that's what the goal will be tonight. I work, Ryan skipped over the details of my bio, thank you for that, but just for those who don't know, I work for a think tank called the Center for Future Work. I worked in the union movement for decades, but now I'm in the think tank world. Center for Future Work is a labor economics think tank that takes a progressive stance on things, and all of our work is open access there. Property is theft, you know, so just visit the site and take advantage of anything that's there, and we've got a mailing list there you can sign up for. Then you'll get occasional updates on our research and so on. And there's my Twitter handle and the Center's Twitter handle. I refuse to call it X. I don't care how much money Elon Musk has. I'm still calling it Twitter. and someday I'll join the 21st century and get on Instagram. But in the meantime, that's what you have. You're welcome to post from this session tonight. What I'd like to go through, I want to talk about inflation. It's front of mind, of course, for our members. They're battling to try and pay the bills and the rent. I want to talk about the risk of a recession ahead and how it's a completely avoidable recession. I want to talk about what's happening in labor markets and the fight to protect our wages. I want to talk about government and some of the boogeyman arguments about deficits and why we have to cut back and tighten belts because of deficits, and that's all nonsense. And then a little bit on strategy for our movement and where we take these arguments. So, inflation. Here is the mountain that we climbed to the top of, and then we've been climbing back down the other side, not quite to the bottom yet. The blue line measures the year-over-year rate of inflation in Canada for goods and services, the Consumer Price Index, counting everything. The dotted red line excludes a couple of items that tend to bounce around a lot. Energy prices, as you know, if you look at the gas stations, and food prices as well, bounce around a lot. If you take out those volatile items, you sometimes get a better idea of where the overall direction of inflation is. Traditionally, over the last generation, inflation has been about 2% a year. And that doesn't mean it's painless. You know, even before the pandemic times, it was hard to bargain wages just to keep up with 2% inflation, right? Let alone 6 or 8% inflation. So even 2% wasn't harmless, but they kind of kept it low in a way that we would forget about it. So we got rid of, or we let them take away some of our COLA clauses and cost of living protection and so on when inflation was low, because people didn't have a full sense of the importance of those things. Now they do, of course, because we've seen what happened. Initially, during the pandemic in 2020, the lockdowns, inflation fell because nobody could go shopping, so the companies had to lower their prices. But then when we got out of the lockdowns, we had some purchasing to make up for, some pent-up demand. We also had money, thanks to the CERB benefits and other emergency supports that were very, very important to getting us through the pandemic. And that's when inflation took off, up to 8% at peak in the middle of 2022. It's come down a long way since then, but not back to where it was. So right now, the various measures show it around 3.5%. So that's not enormously terrible. It's not Zimbabwe, okay? But it's higher than the Bank of Canada likes, and that's why they're going to keep tightening our belts, not their belts, tightening our belts to try and get it back to 2%. Yes, go ahead, brother.
Did you anticipate this coming? With
Did I anticipate the inflation?
Yeah, with CERB and everything that happened.
Right. Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, if I could have, I would have shorted certain products on the stock market, made $1 billion, and donated it all to the union movement to fund organizing campaigns, of course. So, shorter answer is no, I didn't. Nobody did, really, and it wasn't so much the CERB. I mentioned the CERB, but I'll talk actually right now on the next slide about this. How do we understand the inflation and where did it come from? It's all about the pandemic, okay? Obviously, you had hopefully a once-in-a-lifetime catastrophe worldwide where people had to stay home and industries had to shut down. Supply chains were broken. There were shortages of all kinds of things because of that. Semiconductors, new cars, building materials, big screen TVs because we couldn't go out. So we fixed up the rec room and so on. So that was obviously a disruption and going to have some ripple effects. The government did protect our purchasing power with those benefits, and that was much better than the alternative. The alternative would have been to say, well, if you lose your job during COVID, as 3 million Canadians did, tough. You just got to suffer through it. People would have lost their homes. They would have lost their lives. We would have gone into a depression, a full-on depression. So government in Canada and elsewhere stepped in with those benefits. Very important. But it does mean that we had money to spend, not more money than we did before, really, but we had some money to spend at a time when the supply side of the economy was all messed up. So that was a recipe for some action, not necessarily a full-blown inflation cycle, but certainly there was going to be some impacts. We also had a big energy price shock that in retrospect was as important as anything else. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the world oil price, it's set on these futures markets that are all about gambling and speculation and so on. Oil prices shot up. And in Canada, we, in our wisdom, have decided we're going to tie our energy prices to what goes on in those speculative world oil markets, even for energy that's produced in Canada, refined in Canada, and used in Canada. No inherent reason why we have to do that, but we have. And that means that all of that inflationary pressure was transmitted right to us. Another fact, companies took advantage of this situation. They saw the desperation, they saw the shortages, okay, and they said, now's my chance to sock it to them. And they increased their prices way more than the cost of production at that moment because they knew people would pay extra given what was going on. So what we call profit-led inflation was really a big part of this story. And that's a complete difference from the old stories we've heard about the 1970s and the so-called wage price spiral that happened. We could debate what happened actually in the 70s. There's a lot of mythology there. But this inflation had nothing to do with wages. It was more about profits and companies taking advantage of a moment of disruption and crisis and saying, we're going to charge what the market will bear. And some people shrug and say, well, that's capitalism. What do you expect? People are greedy. What are you complaining about? Well, I disagree. I believe there's a moral component in how we treat each other. If you had a plane crash in the middle of the desert and 100 survivors walked out of the desert dying of thirst, and they got to the edge of the desert and there was someone there with a bottled water stand, what would the market bear at that moment? They could sell those bottles of water for $5,000 each. Is that reasonable? That's not supply and demand. That's cruel and greedy, and we absolutely had that happening during the pandemic, and we shouldn't accept it as sort of natural or normal or human nature, not remotely. We've given those companies the power to set prices. Prices are not set by magic, okay? They're not set by nature. They're set by human beings, complete assholes like Galen Weston and his stupid fucking cardigan sweater, okay? Sitting in his office, he sets the price. He does it. It's a human decision that sets the price for those groceries and everything else. It isn't natural. It isn't a market outcome. And we shouldn't let them off the hook by saying, well, that's just supply and demand. Most of those factors have melted away, and this is a good thing. So most people who looked at inflation and the risk of it at that time said it's probably going to be temporary. And it maybe was not as temporary as they hoped. They thought maybe it would be 1 year. Turns out it was more like 2 to 3 years. But it's clearly coming down, and those problems have been resolved. But now we've got a situation where people have had their real wages reduced, and they're trying to catch up. And so the inflation is not back to where it was before, and this is where the Bank of Canada is still going hard with interest rates. We probably won't get any more increases, but it's going to be a while before interest rates start coming down because they want to see inflation back at that 2%, preferred 2% level. So, interestingly enough, the Bank of Canada says we're doing this to fight inflation. And look, it's working. But in fact, the decline in inflation has had almost nothing to do with interest rates. It's mostly been about the repair of those supply chains and the reduction in energy prices. Since the war in Ukraine, as you know, energy prices, gasoline, natural gas, heating oil, has come down a lot. And that has taken a lot of steam out of inflation. And it's got nothing to do with our interest rates. I hate to break it to the Bank of Canada. The people at OPEC don't give a shit what our interest rate is in Canada when they go around trying to set the price of oil, okay? I don't want Tiff Macklem to feel insignificant in the world, but as far as the world oil price goes, he is. And in some ways, what the Bank of Canada has done by jacking up interest rates has made it worse. Here's a fun fact. One key component of the Consumer Price Index is housing. And one key component of housing is how much interest you have to pay on your mortgage, because that's part of the cost of housing. So quite rightly, it's measured within our Consumer Price Index. And right now, it's added a lot to inflation because of the Bank of Canada's actions to fight inflation. How perverse is that? There's a technical term for that in economics. It's called shooting yourself in the foot, okay? Because that's exactly what we've done. They're trying to control inflation, but they're actually making it worse. So, and there's been a lot of rhetoric that it has been about wages and workers demanding too much, and that's what the problem has been, or maybe that's what the problem is going to be in future. So the central bank is trying to stop wages from growing and trying to catch up. We cannot blame wages for this problem. This shows the history of inflation. This is the same blue line, consumer prices up the mountain and down the mountain. The red line shows the growth of average hourly wages in Canada over that period, which were only growing at about 1 or 2%. And now we've been trying to catch up to that very rapid inflation. And anybody who's worked on bargaining with your local union knows exactly what that's about. You got to sit down at the bargaining table and try and get a wage increase that is going to at least cover inflation. That's the goal, and maybe make up for some of the past losses. And we're trying to do that. Both unions and individual workers are demanding more. Wages now, on average, running at about 5% a year. We'll see how long that lasts. And only in the last 9 months or so have we caught up to inflation, and now we're starting to repair some of the damage. But that whole area where the blue line was above the red line translated into a reduction in the purchasing power of average wages in Canada. And that's where Canadians have had such a cost of living challenge. Now we're trying to make up for those losses on the other side, but the Bank of Canada wants to get that red line down. It is also not because of excess demand. This is, again, language of the Bank of Canada and others to say the reason inflation took off was we had too much money to spend. That was the problem. Too much demand given the limited supply. They say there's a demand-supply imbalance, and the problem is too much demand. You see what happened? This is real household consumption spending, so our real ability to buy goods and services as consumers per person in Canada. And it was, kind of trucking along before the pandemic. Then it collapsed with the pandemic because of all of the job losses and so on. It got rebuilt in part because of the income supports and then the economy reopening. There, by the second quarter of 2022, so mid-2022, at the moment that inflation was reaching its peak, excess demand, average real demand from Canadian consumers was only just reached back to where it was before the pandemic, some 3 years later. So 0.8%, hardly any difference at all. You cannot look at that and say, wow, that's what set the whole thing in motion. Absolutely not. And now demand is falling because of high interest rates and falling real wages. And so now we're well below. So the average Canadian is buying less stuff per person, less actual stuff in real terms than they were 5 years ago. 5 years ago. So that's amazing. And there's no possibility that you can say that was too much. Another false culprit is Poilievre's favorite hobby horse, which is the carbon price, the federal carbon price. And then in some provinces like BC, they have a provincial carbon price that kind of matches. And he is ready to blame anything that ails you on the carbon price. And if nothing ails you, that's due to the carbon price as well, okay? So there's no problem he's met that he can't try to blame on the carbon price, including inflation. And the historical evidence is absolutely clear. There's no relationship at all. In fact, there's an inverse relationship. When the carbon price first came in 2019, inflation fell. Then inflation took off when the increases in the carbon price per year, up by $10 a ton, were relatively low. Now this year we had a higher increase in the carbon price because of the climate program, and inflation fell. So there's absolutely no way you can blame the price of gas or overall inflation on the carbon price. It's all about the energy industry and the money they're making, taking advantage of the speculation and the chaos in the world to sock it to us when they can. And then when things stabilize, the price comes back down.
What about the farmers and food prices?
Farmers and food prices. You can't blame farmers for food prices either. I mentioned Galen Weston a little earlier. We can blame him. We can blame the supermarket industry, and I'll show that down the road. But farmers, certainly small farmers, have been suffering. They've been paying more for the energy and other input costs, and they get squeezed at the other end by the big food processors and buyers who have restrained their incomes. Some of our farm prices, of course, in Canada are still regulated. We've got marketing boards for dairy products and chicken and egg, but that has, again, just been trying to keep up with costs, not causing the inflation.
I just saw that chicken is twice as much here as it is in other provinces.
Twice as much in BC?
Twice as much in BC.
Yeah, I've been in other provinces. I'm not sure that's true. We do have a BC chicken marketing system here that's part of that marketing board thing, and there's a debate right now where the restaurateurs are complaining that the price is going up. So we should check into the evidence on that. But the food prices are clearly they're first of all an indirect impact of the overall inflation. And then it's been supercharged by the profits that the supermarkets have been making.
What can help explain this inverse relationship?
Well, I'm not saying that a higher carbon price actually causes lower inflation, Although you could come up with a story. The story is it encourages you to conserve energy, and it encourages you to switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy. That's the whole point of the carbon price. And then it gives the money back to consumers in that rebate that you get every 3 months, I think.
They don't get a rebate here, though. They'll get a rebate in other provinces.
No, BC gets a rebate. They get a provincial rebate. The other provinces that don't participate get a federal rebate that comes from Ottawa. In BC, it comes from the BC government. So they give back the amount. It's, tied to different levels of family income and so on. So there is definitely a provincial rebate, and the provincial tax is meant to be revenue neutral, just like the federal tax is. So you collect the money and then you give it back to people. The goal of it is to change your behavior. You end up with, in aggregate, as much money as you started with, but in theory, you have an incentive to go to renewable energy and to conserve energy, both of which could take away some of the sting of inflation. What can we blame it on? Well, if it's an imbalance between supply and demand, well, we got to look at the supply side. We got to look at what we're producing. We got to look at what I talked about was the bloodstream of the economy. People getting out of bed and doing their jobs and adding real value and producing stuff. Whether it's goods, whether it's services, whether it's public services, that work is the supply of our economy, and it adds up to our GDP. And we haven't even repaired the damage to our GDP after the pandemic. So we had a trend of modest growth, not really strong growth, but modest growth until the pandemic hit. Then we fall down the cliff. Then we climb our way back up the cliff, and we were still quite a long ways from repairing the damage and getting back to where we should have been. When the Bank of Canada said, whoa, things are getting too hot here, we got to slow it down. And that's where the high interest rates started in March 2022. And at that point, we no longer were even getting closer to the red line, which was our pre-COVID trend. We're now moving further away from the red line because the Bank of Canada is prematurely cutting off the recovery of our supply side. And that means, guess what? Shortages. What's one thing we don't produce enough of in Canada? What do we need? A heck of a lot more. Housing. No kidding. No kidding. Our population is growing. There's not enough affordable housing. We should be producing more, not less. And would that help reduce inflation? You bet it would. Look at what's happened to housing prices. If we had more supply rather than less, housing prices wouldn't be going bananas like they are, especially right now for rents. Rents are very, very expensive because people can't afford to buy a house anymore, so they're in the rental market, and that's driving up rents like crazy. So we need more work, and this is where the union's economic lens comes in, because we have to say on behalf of our members, we are the workers, we are the ones who produce the value added, and our economy would be stronger if we produced more value added, especially in key areas, whether it's essentials like housing or infrastructure or public services. We need more of it, not less. Let's get to work. And that is a very kind of handy lens to go at the government and the Bank of Canada and the employers when they try to say, no, things are too hot, we got to cut back. We shouldn't be cutting back, we should be doing more, especially in some of those key areas. Another thing that you could blame, as I hinted, is corporate profits, taking advantage of the pandemic to absolutely fatten their bottom line. So this shows net corporate profits in Canada. They fell at first a bit, not too dramatically. They fell a bit during the pandemic, then they absolutely took off when the lockdowns ended and people went back to shopping, and they could get away with charging super high prices but still have people buy their stuff. And profits grew 70% between the lockdowns and mid-2022. Mid-2022, not coincidentally, is when inflation peaked at over 8%. Then profits have started to come down, and surprise, surprise, inflation has started to come down, in part because supply chains have normalized, and the unique factors, and for the most part temporary factors, that allowed companies to rip us off so badly during that period have been resolved. So their profits are falling, and this is a good thing. Investors don't like it, they're going to complain about it, but from the perspective of how the economy is working, that peak in profits, which was the highest share of GDP in our history in Canada. Imagine that, we are, 155 years old, 165 years old, whatever the math is, 155 years old, and lo and behold, At the moment of national health and economic crisis, companies were making more money than they ever have in history as a share of our economy. So talk about an upside down world, okay? Catastrophe for us, profit opportunity for them. And they went to town. Yes?
I'm just curious with this, what you're saying. So with my union, contracts aren't up, negotiations for another year and a bit, 400 something days. And we've already lost COLA, and it went into arbitration, but we've lost it. And now with it, profits coming down and inflation coming down, by the time it comes to negotiate our contract, you're gonna find, even though they made record profits, they're gonna find some way to like not give us what we deserve for wage increases. How do you fight that?
Right, yeah, well, that's where we need good economic arguments and good economic data. I hope you've got some good research support when you go into bargaining. What you'll be able to show is that your wages lagged behind inflation during that period, as they clearly did. You know, my guess is probably by 5 or 6 or 7% cumulative over the length of that last contract. So that means in real terms, your members are working for less. And you got to tell the employer that's not acceptable. We got to make up for the damage that's been lost. Plus, we have to protect against the inflation that's still coming, right? Inflation is still happening, 3.5% right now, and it's going to come down, but it's not going to come down overnight. So, you know, I just had a meeting with the teachers' unions today talking about bargaining strategy for their groups. And, you know, in some cases, they signed 3-year contracts at exactly the wrong moment, just by bad luck. You know, beginning of 2021. You're still in the heavy pandemic, lots of pressure, modest wages, sometimes 1%, and then all of a sudden inflation took off. Now the 3-year contracts just expired, and their members have lost literally 9% of their real purchasing power over that 3-year period.
Sign a 10-year contract.
Oh,
Yeah.
ouch,
Coming up, yeah.
ouch, 10 years. Okay, well, that was a mistake, whether there's a pandemic or not, TBH. But anyways, now you've got a lot. Now you've got a lot to try and make up for. Oh, I love this group. We are never going to get through all our slides, Ryan, I'll tell you that. But that's just fine, because we're having a pedagogical moment here, right? Okay. I know you're a popular educator. You know, you care about the group engagement in the learning process. I'm not just going to listen to the experts. And I'm supposed to define my terms, right, as I go along, so that we don't. That's another principle of popular education. Like, for example, a technical term like bullshit. Okay. Bullshit is a technical term. It means hypothesis inconsistent with empirical evidence. Okay. So that's if I use that jargon in the course of the presentation, you'll understand it. So, anyways, the Bank of Canada is intent on pointing the finger at workers to blame for this problem. They have said purchasing power was too high, excess demand. They've said wages were growing too fast. They've said the unemployment rate was too low. Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, stood up at a hoity-toity conference at the Royal York Hotel in Toronto and literally said the unemployment rate is too low. We have to get it up. Can you believe that? This is like one of the most important economic officials in the country, and he's being paid to get unemployment up. That is so perverse. Just like it's perverse that companies made more money than they ever have in history during the middle of a pandemic. And that's what they're trying to do. So that was why they jacked up interest rates, and they said, we're going to do whatever it takes to get inflation back to 2%. And that means no matter what. That means even if there's a recession, even if there's massive unemployment, even if there's hardship, even if people lose their homes, we're going to get our inflation back to 2%. That's what they're intent on doing. I think most people think they've peaked interest rates because of the decline in interest rates the decline in inflation and the weakening economy. But it's clear they're not going to cut interest rates. The Bank of Canada is meeting tomorrow for their next announcement. Probably they're going to keep it where it is. They're not going to cut for some time to come because they still think inflation at that 3.5% is too high, and they still blame excess demand for it. So this shows the increases, the very rapid increases in the interest rate in Canada and the United States in blue. The gray line is what people actually pay. You often hear about the bank rate being 5.25%, but of course that's not what you pay. If you've got a car loan or a mortgage or something, you pay much more than that. The difference is the profits for the banks. So it's more like 7% that the average consumer would pay, and that makes it really expensive to buy stuff. It makes it really expensive to buy a home. It makes it very challenging to make an investment if you're an actual business. It makes it very challenging to build new housing, for example, because that's a very interest-sensitive sector. So this is why the economy is slowing down so much. We did talk a bit about groceries, but I want to show you just a little bit here. Food inflation, of course, was even higher than regular inflation. It peaked at 12%, not 8%, and that's a terrible outcome. The companies are able. We have a very cozy little system in Canada. Very cozy system. The technical term, this is an actual technical term, is oligopoly. Oligopoly is a term, it's like monopoly. You know, monopoly is where there's only one company selling something, right? Oligopoly is where there's just a small number selling something. And we have a raging oligopoly in our grocery industry, the three big chains, and then all of their brand names. Look at all of the different store brands that are actually owned by the same three companies. So it looks like there's more diversity out there, but there isn't. Those three control 2/3 of the market. If you throw in Walmart and Costco, it's 80% of the market, controlled by the big five firms, which makes it very easy for them to increase prices more than their costs. And that's exactly what we've done. And Galen Weston stands up and tries to look sincere and says, we're just an intermediary, it's not our fault. But what was that technical term again? Oh yeah, bullshit. And we've seen supermarket profits more than double since COVID, and they claim that it's just because people are buying more food. In fact, they're buying less food. Canadians are buying less food per person because it's so expensive. That means they're going to farmers markets, they're going to food banks, unfortunately, or worst of all, making do without. And that is happening in Canada because of the power of those corporations. But it was not just supermarkets. We hate the supermarkets, and we should, okay? But it wasn't just them, and there's lots of blame to go around. The same thing happened in our energy industry. In fact, the profit margins, the profits in the energy sector, oil and gas sector, and petroleum products were astronomical, many times more than the profits in the supermarket industry. I wish those bastards got the same kind of critical attention as Galen Weston does. And overall, we ended up with a big impact on prices. We did some research in our center for the 15 biggest sectors that contributed to inflation in Canada at that peak inflation in mid-2022. There's about 50 different industries measured by Statistics Canada. 15 of them accounted for more than 100% of all of the increase in corporate profits. So the grocery stores are number 14. So, they should be blamed. They absolutely added to inflation, but there was a lot of other things happening with energy, banks, building materials and primary products, car dealers. Did anybody try to buy a new car in the pandemic? Yeah. And did the dealer kind of say, well, we haven't got any stock, but if you pay for an extra contract for servicing and or pay a little premium price, maybe we can find one, right? That's what they were doing. And the price of cars, even used cars, went astronomical because new cars were in such short supply. They made more money. The car dealers made more money than the supermarkets, believe it or not. So this is where greed was the problem, not workers. Now we have a situation where the Bank of Canada's tough medicine for all of this and misdiagnosing the problem and scapegoating the victims rather than the culprits, we're now on the edge of a recession in Canada. The Bank of Canada's plan, such as it is working. Their goal was to raise unemployment and slow down the economy and suck purchasing power out of households, and that's exactly what they've done, especially for houses with mortgages, but other families as well. Anyone who owes money on anything, a student loan, a car loan, a credit card, anything else is much harder to pay the bills. Even if you just got caught in the sort of collateral damage because of high rents, you can't pay the bills. Economists define a recession in technical terms as 2 consecutive quarters. A quarter is a 3-month period, and if you had 2 of them in a row where the economy was shrinking, that's considered a recession. Very arbitrary rule, and in some ways it's quite misleading. But I think we're on the verge of one. We had a negative quarter in the third quarter of 2023 in the fall, And we won't get the data until the end of February, but if the fourth quarter of 2023 is also negative, then we've got the technical recession. Now, I wouldn't get hung up on whether it's a technical recession or not. It doesn't really matter whether you're slightly above zero or whether you're slightly below zero. It's the fact that you're at zero that is the problem. That means, you know, the economy has stopped, and that means people's living standards are going to fall, especially given how fast our population is growing right now. We have an enormous increase in population in the years since the pandemic. Last year, our population grew 3% in 1 year. That hasn't happened since the 50s. And it's unlike any other industrial country. So, you know, obviously we're going to express solidarity with immigrants, and we're going to refuse to let immigrants get scapegoated, just like we're not going to let workers get scapegoated. On the other hand, there are things that are happening in our immigration system, especially the wide open permits for temporary foreign workers that companies are using, who don't have full rights and minimum wages, and also the exploitation of international students, many of whom get sucked in here by the private colleges and so on. These are things we absolutely have to look at, but we have to look at them in a way, in a unifying, solidaristic way, not a scapegoating way. The reality is, with population growing so quick, on a per capita basis, our economy is shrinking. So this shows the quarterly growth in our GDP, and the big bars at the beginning are when we were recovering quickly from the pandemic. We did a great job partially recovering from the pandemic. Then we got the interest rate hikes starting, and we see that it's all been downhill since, including a negative quarter there at the end. That was the third quarter of 2023. If we get another one, then that's the technical recession. The reason the economy is in such weak shape, consumer spending has really flatlined because of the interest rate hikes. Governments even should be spending more, but they're still kind of infatuated with balancing the budget and showing that they're fiscally responsibility. The housing sector is tanking because of high interest rates. Business investment's been very weak because of high interest rates. The only bright light so far has been exports. We're lucky because our exports have been pretty strong, mostly because we live next to the United States. And the United States economy has been going like gangbusters. I'll show you that in a minute. So how long that continues, all depends. This shows you our GDP per person, our per capita real GDP. And again, it fell dramatically during the pandemic, started to recover, just got back to where it had been before the pandemic when the Bank of Canada stepped in to say, we got to slow things down, and now it's declined in 4 of the last 5 quarters and is now lower. Our GDP per capita is lower than it was in 2017, 6 years ago. So it's like we've had wasted years. Now, of course, we had a pandemic, so you're going to have a crisis. But to look at that and say we're producing too much is absolutely bass-ackwards. That's a technical term in economics, bass-ackwards. It means direction of causation illegitimately reversed, okay? That's what bass-ackwards means. Here's this Canada-US comparison I was talking about. The US economy grew 4.9% annual rate in the third quarter, whereas ours shrunk 1.1% annual rate in the third quarter. Their unemployment rate is lower. Their inflation is exactly the same as ours. Go figure, okay? And their deficit is humongous compared to ours, okay? We're all obsessed with balancing the budget. In America, they've got huge deficits and they don't give a shit, okay? And ironically, that's actually helped the U.S. economy do very, very, very well. So there's that thing at the end there, the inflation being identical between the two countries. So Poilievre's story that the inflation is due to the deficit, no. If that's true, how could this graph occur? Or it's due to the carbon tax. U.S. has no carbon tax, and they're the same as us. So the whole storyline about trying to blame Pierre Trudeau for everything, Pierre Trudeau, oh my God.
Close,
I just dated myself there. To blame Justin Trudeau for everything is failing. Yes?
So you said that they don't give a shit. Do you know why? Like, why don't they give a shit?
Well, I mean, in a way, they have an advantage, being the biggest economy in the world, and also the U.S. dollar is used, you know, kind of as a mode of currency internationally. So they have a bit more leeway than we do, but mostly it's because I think the policymakers in the States have been more pragmatic and less wedded to a particular religious belief that the budget must be balanced. We learned in the global financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, Deficits are often a good thing, not a bad thing. And at times of trouble, you want a deficit. Whereas in Canada, I think we're still grudging about, well, okay, if we have a deficit, we better get rid of it as quickly as possible, and that's what's happened here. Okay, let's talk a bit about the labor market and what's happening there with unemployment and wages. The Bank of Canada's goal was to increase unemployment. They think that there's a certain level of unemployment that we need. That acronym there, NAIRU, that's the most god-awful acronym in economics, NAIRU, and it is not an island covered in bird shit in the South Pacific. That's Nauru, okay? NAIRU is non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. That's the idea. And the idea is you have to keep unemployment at a certain healthy level in order to keep workers in line, basically, is the story. So this is the theory that the Bank of Canada follows, and they're trying to get back to what they think the NAIRU is. Problem is you can't measure it, you can't see it, it's always changing, but basically they'll say if wages are growing too much, it's because unemployment is too low. That is just their assumption. It is meeting its goal, but in a surprising way. Unemployment has increased by about a percentage point, or about 250,000 people, since the lowest point, which was July 2022 again. Despite that, employment has continued to grow. Although slowly, it has continued to grow. So we have a funny combination of rising employment and rising unemployment at the same time. Kind of unusual. And the way you square the circle there is because labor supply growth is so strong. Our population is growing so quick. The fact that we're creating some work, but not enough for all those new people, means the unemployment rate is growing and job vacancies are falling. So this shows the difference between supply and demand in the labor market. Labor demand is employment. That's when employers demand that workers come and do something and we'll pay you for it. Labor supply is the number of workers in the labor force, either employed or willing to be employed and seeking work. And again, employment was growing very strongly in 21 and 22 as we recovered from the pandemic. Then the Bank of Canada's interest rates hit, and you see how we slowed down, but we're still positive. That's a good thing. Labor supply, meanwhile, has become faster, and now the two lines have crossed again. So the blue line is ahead of the red line now. That means our labor force is growing faster than the number of jobs available for them to do. And that's where rising unemployment occurs in a gradual increase. So the unemployment rate fell to below 5% at peak. This is great. It gives people confidence. I don't know. I've got young adult kids, and I tell you, the fact that there was a period of time when they, first of all, were not worried that they'd be able to find a job, okay? They knew they could find a job. That in and of itself was new. I haven't really seen that in the last 40 years. And then the fact that they actually had a shot at a decent job. You know, my older kid has got a unionized living wage job. They're a member of HEU. They get benefits. They got a fucking defined benefit pension plan, you know? And I thought, if 10 years ago, if I ever thought my kids could get a living wage job with a defined benefit pension plan, I'd say I must be on drugs or something. And it's because of that situation of a very tight labor market and lots of job vacancies. So that was great for working people, especially young people just joining the labor market, and completely unacceptable for employers and the Bank of Canada, okay? They don't want a situation where people are confident they can get a job. They want a situation where people are worried whether they can get another job, and therefore they show up at work and behave, and don't demand, and don't ask for too much, and bow down in thanks that they've got a job. That is the world that employers like, and the Bank of Canada, in essence, is trying to fulfill that wish for them.
Hi, just a clarification. When you say unemployment rate, are you speaking to the decline of unemployment with part-time jobs, full-time jobs, those sort of jobs? Because there is a difference.
Yes.
Because there has been this thing of there is lots of jobs in the market, but they're part-time jobs. Ideally, we are not providing that to the community. Like, people need actual meaningful employment that can actually have a living wage as well. So I just want to know, because I want to understand the statistic properly. And so I just wanted to ask you, the unemployment rate, are you speaking to just whatever considers to be employment, like that as an umbrella term?
Wow, that is a brilliant question. Thank you. Would you like to be an economist one day? You would so cut it. Okay, thank you. short answer, yes, this is the umbrella term. So the unemployment rate is just measuring who doesn't have a job, period. It doesn't ask what kind of job have you got. And you're quite right to say we have to be cautious in how we interpret these statistics, because to show up as employed, okay, you just have to have worked 1 hour in the week when Statistics Canada did the survey. So you could have a part-time gig, you could be an Uber driver, and you just worked 3 hours and you're employed, and anything else. So it misses a lot. And in that regard, I always argued that the unemployment situation was not as good as it looked. Okay? Now, that being true, it was still good. It was still good compared to what it had been in other times in history.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Yeah.
The reason why I asked it is because I was noticing a trend, and I thought about gig workers, and specifically
Yes.
the spike that happened.
Right.
Is it like a reflection of that? Because I know that especially during COVID period of times, as people got laid off, gig
Yes.
working became definitely
Yes.
an increase.
Yes.
And so, just like a personal, I was like, is that something that is right now being reflected?
Yes.
Like, okay.
Yeah, very good point. Now, here's an interesting, a couple of interesting things. On the gig stuff, when the unemployment rate was that low, the gig companies had a hard time finding drivers. Even Uber was having a hard time finding drivers when the unemployment rate was that low. And it's because people could actually find a good job. And even the share of part-time, we do watch the share of part-time work, but the share of part-time work declined as the unemployment rate declined, in part because employers realized they had to offer a better deal, including regular schedules and benefits and full-time work in many cases. Even restaurants and retail stores and so on, that are usually the worst culprits, had to improve their offer to find people. The blue line there is the job vacancy rate. This is the share of jobs in the economy that employers report that they can't fill. Now, this statistic has to be taken with a grain of salt as well. For example, restaurants always have job vacancies, not because we've run out of workers, but because they pay such shitty wages and shitty conditions that people leave all the time. So some restaurants are always advertising for people. Okay, so does that mean that we've really got unfilled vacancies? I don't really think so. But nevertheless, job vacancies really spiked after the lockdowns ended. As you would expect, the businesses shut down, people went their ways, and then the businesses suddenly reopened. And of course, it's going to take a little while to find people. So at that moment, this is when alarm bells rang. Employers said there's a labor shortage and we've got to fix it. Okay, so they want cut off the CERB. That was where that demand came from. Don't improve EI. We were supposed to fix our EI system through the pandemic, and that issue's died because the Liberals have heard the employers saying we don't want more EI, we've got a labor shortage. Extend the pension age. Remember Stephen Harper pushed back the pension age to 67? Justin Trudeau, son of Pierre Trudeau, reversed that and took it back to 65, which was good. But now you've got the Fraser Institute and other business groups saying, no, we've got a labor shortage, we've got to push it out to 67 again. And, of course, the businesses have really been pushing the temporary foreign worker program as their solution to labor shortage. We like a labor shortage. What is a labor shortage for employers is something closer to full employment for workers. And this, again, is where it all depends on what side of the tracks you are when you're trying to study the economy. This is this population growth thing that I was talking about. The Canadian population grew 3% last year. We haven't seen anything like that since the 50s. That, in a way, was in track already. After 2015, the Liberals federally really opened up immigration numbers, including the temporary programs. But after the pandemic, they really opened it up. And this is where the big increase in population is coming from. And again, I stress, we have to be rigorous in making sure this doesn't come out in an anti-immigrant or racist way. Poilievre and his crew will jump on this, and they already are starting to jump on this in some really ugly ways. But we have to talk about what kind of immigration makes sense. Fully supported immigration where people come with full rights, the ability to do full jobs, and get the housing and the services and everything else they need for a good life in Canada. And that's not what this is. This is where the immigration is happening right now. 2/3 of the whole increase in population is temporary migrant workers or international students who are expected to work now. They've deregulated how much work the students do, and this is a big problem. We're fighting back, workers are fighting back to try and catch up to inflation and protect our wages and win back some of the losses that we might have experienced in the last 2 or 3, or in some cases 10 years. And we're making some progress on that. Despite the gradual increase in unemployment that we have seen, unions are pushing hard and winning in many cases, backed by strikes when needed. So we have seen a big increase in strike activity in Canada, and this is, again, a good thing. Employers will whine and cry. I heard them whining and crying today about the bus drivers in Vancouver. Not the bus drivers, but the bus supervisors, and the bus drivers wouldn't cross their line, so the bus system was down, and you got all the employers saying, order them back. You know, we want to have a dictatorship, basically. And same goes for the federal anti-scab law that's going to be on Parliament's books, and so on. Yes, I think that deserves a round of applause. I agree. Thanks mostly to us and our movement and fighting for it for all those years and cleverly leveraging the political opportunity right now. So this is the number of days lost in work stoppages. It includes lockouts. But lately, there have been hardly no lockouts because we've got the hammer right now. So employers are very reluctant to lock out. Almost all of these are strikes. Public sector is in red. So 2023, that's just the first 9 months. They haven't released the data yet for the full year. When they do, it'll be way up above the top of the graph because in the last months, there were still some big strikes, including the big strikes in Quebec. So this is a good sign, and it means that we're starting to rebuild and catch up again. So for the last 9 months, wages have been growing faster than prices, and that means the real wage, adjusted for inflation, is starting to grow again. This shows 2 measures: the average across the whole labor market. The median wage, in a way, is a better measure because it captures the exact mid-person, okay, the person who's 50% up the income ladder. That's what the median means. And it's more accurate than the average for the reason that the average can get pulled up by someone making $1 million a year, and they're included in here. So they lift the average, but they don't really represent what people actually live like. So the median wage grew by about 2.5% after inflation last year. That, you know, you can see is making up for some of the declines that were experienced after the pandemic, and that's a good sign. On the other hand, it is not universally shared. So if you compare where the real wage is now compared to 2019 when the pandemic, just before the pandemic, overall real wages are up 2.6%, but in some industries, they're still lower than they were before the pandemic. What do those 3 industries have in common? They're all public sector. So healthcare, education, and government. And lo and behold, you've got very austere governments. You've got, in many cases, anti-union laws like Bill 124 in Ontario, which was overturned but was in effect for several years, and other restrictions. Now in Saskatchewan, of course, the teachers are fighting right now to try and win back some of this. So this will be a hot topic because, again, Poilievre and them are going to say this is fat cats, trying to line their own pockets, and we can't afford it. All right, I think I am going too long. How are people feeling? Should I've got another 5-7 minutes. We're okay to keep going? Okay. Woo! This is awesome. Not only did you skip the bar, but you stayed overtime. Wow. So thank you again for your interest. Just a couple more minutes. In terms of government's ability to pay for things like teachers and nurses and healthcare workers and government workers, they've got all kinds of room. Here's a dirty, dark secret. Governments make money from inflation, just like corporations make money from inflation. Why? Because the taxes go up automatically when prices go up. And of course, some expenses of government also go up with inflation. But the reality is the revenues go up more strongly than the expenses do. And that means that even though the economy has slowed down, which is usually bad for the budget, despite that, government finances have continued to improve over the last couple of years since the pandemic, which means governments can absolutely pay fair wages to teachers, nurses, healthcare workers, and their own employees. All they're doing there, they've got this enormous dividend, an inflation dividend that they're pocketing, and all they're doing is they're taking a small piece of it, not even a tenth, and giving it back to the workers who have to keep up with the very same inflation. So honestly, governments can't have it both ways. Their ability to pay for public sector salaries and wages, but also public services, the delivery of public services, their ability is not in question at all. This shows the deficits at the federal government level and the provincial government level in macroeconomic terms, measured as a share of GDP. And you see what happened in the pandemic. The feds in particular ran up a huge deficit, only exceeded by the deficit we had during World War II. Okay, other than that, this is the biggest deficit we've ever had, and with good reason. We paid out the CERB and all the other income benefits and the healthcare expenses to save our lives and protect us from being thrown out of our homes during a depression. So this was great. This is one of those times the deficit is great. And for Poilievre to stand up and say this was wrong, okay, and blame anything that's happening today on government moving to save lives and prevent a depression is absolutely misinformation. Then the government got rid of CERB and the other benefits pretty quick as the economy recovered and the economy grew, and then we had inflation. All of those reasons, the federal government was back in effective economic balance by 2022, and it stayed there since. Bits of ups and downs depending on accounting charges and contingent liabilities, and finance ministers have taken up always putting in these gigantic cushions in their budgets to give themselves wiggle room. But for all intents and purposes, the federal government is balanced, and so are the provincial budgets. So the deficit is not an excuse to say that we have to tighten our belts. Absolutely, absolutely not. Neither is the debt. The debt is the accumulated amount that's owed by government. And again, government debt can be a good thing too, including to stabilize financial markets, because usually whenever there's uncertainty, like there was in the financial crisis or during COVID, investors and banks want government bonds, because government bonds are considered very safe and stable and secure. So this is actually, again, a good thing, not a bad thing. Debt had been declining in Canada since the 90s. An uptick, a significant uptick in the initial years of COVID, but coming down very quickly since, in part because of inflation. This is another benefit of inflation for government. It's a way of, in essence, reducing the real value of the debt. Okay, let me wrap up with just a few thoughts. We've tried to review the economy and the current challenges of the economy from the workers' point of view. Think about a narrative that strengthens us and puts the blame where it belongs, rather than allowing our members to be scapegoated. What do we do with this? I was struck during the pandemic by the reality that perhaps for a short period of time, the normal rules of the game were thrown out the window. For example, government spent a lot of money and spent it very quickly, and they didn't care about the deficit, and that was a good thing. And so we could have a situation where government was using its resources to do what it needed to do, regardless of the deficit. And in fact, it had an unlimited ability to do that. The idea that government couldn't do it was nonsense. In fact, we could. We mobilized hundreds of billions of dollars in weeks to take care of ourselves. What else changed? We had a situation, with the healthcare workers, of course. We stood on the balcony and banged pots for a few months. But not just the healthcare workers. We recognized other workers doing their job at that time as courageous and heroic and essential. Even clerks at grocery stores, right? We had to shop in order to get food, and that means they had to go to work before masks, before vaccines. They were literally risking their lives to do that work for us, as were delivery drivers, as were cleaners, as were carers. And so those jobs were seen as essential, and to some extent, for a while, we paid them more. The grocery store workers got an extra $2 an hour for a few months, until that oligopoly got together and said, enough of that, they're not heroes anymore, take away the $2. But I think it changed people's consciousness about what work is and how we need to value it and how we need to value the people doing it. And it also changed workers' consciousness about their own value and what they're willing to put up with. It's one thing to say I have to take the bus downtown to work for maybe 3 or 4 hours minimum wage at a store or a cafe. But if I might catch COVID in the course of that, then I'm really going to think about whether that's worth it or not. And a lot of people left shitty jobs during and after the pandemic. They didn't stop working, okay? You've seen our labor supply. Our labor supply is growing, and our participation rate is as high as ever. But they did change their attitude and their expectations, and that's a source of power for our movement as well. We even had a situation where the unemployment rate got to that very low point. 4.9% was the lowest, and that's the lowest it's been since the 60s. And poverty declined. Imagine that. Poverty in the middle of the pandemic declined because of these income support payments that were going out. That means we could absolutely eliminate poverty. If we chose as a society to eliminate poverty, we could do it. We could do it next year. And so suddenly, in a way, we've had a glimpse. They've sort of pulled back the curtain, and we can see what the real options of our society are, rather than the sort of artificially constrained options that they try to limit us on the basis of, well, we must balance the budget, and we must keep unemployment at or above the NAIRU, and we must privatize, and so on and so forth. So that was a dangerous moment for people with a vested interest in the status quo, and that's why, while they tolerated for a temporary period things like the CERB and big deficits, as soon as it looked like they could, they tried to get back to normal, including at the corporate level, taking away the $2 an hour from the grocery clerks and squeezing workers just like any other time. At the political level, reasserting the need for a balanced budget and austerity and restraint. At the financial level, the Bank of Canada focusing on inflation control no matter what else. So they want to get back to normal, and we don't want that normal. That normal was not working for us, and we know that there are better ways to run the economy to meet human needs. As I mentioned, the economy is a sum total of our work. We get out of bed, we use our brains and brawn, we produce value added. That's what GDP is. That's where income comes from. That's where prosperity comes from. That's where taxes come from. And so we want an economy where we can do more of that and do it better and have our work valued. That includes better ways to manage inflation rather than scapegoating people who are victims of it through high interest rates. There's all kinds of things we could do to reduce inflation without throwing the economy into a recession. It means better ways to fund public services and the workers who deliver those services based on a fiscal system that collects fair taxes and treats public sector workers respectfully. And better ways to make sure that everyone shares in prosperity, rather than assuming you always have to have 6 or 7% of people, even at the official unemployment rate, which means it's worse than that when you think about all the other things. We, instead of saying we have to hold those people hostage at all times, okay, we have to make sure they can't get work. Because if they could get work, we'd fall below the NAIRU, and that would be bad. And that won't stop us from blaming those people. Okay, the people who are unemployed, even though they've been deliberately unemployed by a macroeconomic system aimed at keeping them unemployed, will still be finger pointed at and said, you don't have the right work ethic, you didn't study the right skills at college, you need to be punished. Okay, even though in theory they're supposedly providing a service for us by keeping the labor market healthy. Instead of doing that, okay, let's find another way to regulate the labor market so we could get unemployment even lower and wage growth that was steady, not outlandish, steady and sustainable and fair, and get rid of poverty through income programs that we know can work. These are things we absolutely could do. And in the course of both resisting the austerity that we're going to face in the next year or two, all the more so if some of these anti-democratic populists like Trump and Poilievre and their friends in other countries, we've seen it happening in Italy and Hungary and Argentina, if they come in, we've got a heck of a fight against that vision. And at the same time as we resist that, we have to keep that hopeful, fair idea of an economy that can work better. An economy that can work better for workers, because workers are the economy. And thank you very much for giving up your Tuesday night to come and hear that. Thank you. I do, yeah.
So we do have some time for some questions. Jim has also shared his slide deck with me, so we'll be sending out a text message tomorrow with a link to it. I also will make a pitch, because I don't know if you will. Jim has an excellent book called Economics for Everyone. So it talks about a lot of the topics he talked about, specifically the difference between unemployment and full employment and all that sort of stuff, the different definitions. And it's not a word of lie. I reference that book on a weekly basis, talking to friends and family about the economy and the difference and what the economy is. And the capitalism is a form of economy. It's not the only form of economy. So excellent book. Really encourage you to pick it up and have a read. So a couple of questions. Anybody have any questions they want to? So we'll go here and then at the back.
I just want to know what your thoughts are on universal basic income.
Universal basic income, what a great question. Universal basic income, in a way, is taking that CERB that we had for a while and making it a permanent feature, and even broadening it out a bit. The CERB was not truly universal. You had to have worked in the previous year in order to qualify. But in a way, it was a very different way of delivering income support compared to EI, or let alone provincial welfare, where people have to jump through hoops and do all kinds of things for a sub-poverty level of income. The CERB was set at a level that wasn't rich, but you could certainly pay your basic costs with it. And what if we offered that to people all the time? And so there is a movement calling for universal basic income. My own sense strategically, as well as economically, is it's better to go at it incrementally rather than say, here's a big magic new program and everyone's going to get it. I think that would be politically and economically hard to digest. I would prefer to see us expand the groups of people who are given income assurance and income security. We already do that to some extent. Everyone over 65 gets a minimum of the OAS and the GIS, and that takes you to something very close to the poverty line. So seniors' poverty in Canada is quite low. Children get through their families the child tax benefit and other payments, and child poverty has fallen dramatically in Canada since the Liberals brought that in. This is a humongous success story. I would like to see it done for young adults. I'd like to see some kind of a basic income type thing for young adults as they go through university and say to their mid-20s until they get established. A universal benefit for people with disabilities would be another way to kind of gradually expand the coverage of a basic income. Maybe someday we could get to a basic income for everyone. And one advantage of that is employers would really have to up their offer, okay? If we've got an ability to survive at a basic level, not a rich level, but a basic level without putting up with their shit, then the employers are going to have to improve their wages and their conditions and their respect in order to get the workforce that they need. And that's exactly why employers will fight this to the end of the world, as they did opposing the CERB. So, great question.
Back here, and then we'll go to the front.
You had a slide there about average and median wages.
Yes.
Of them, the one bar graph on there. Those were Canadian statistics, right?
Yes.
How would BC compare to what was presented there for Canadian statistics? Any idea?
I don't think there'd be a whole lot of difference in the average and median wages for the whole labor market. I think the trends have been similar. BC's economy has done pretty well through the pandemic, in part thanks to a very kind of expansive strategy by the provincial government, which deserves credit. They've spent a lot of money on investment and services and hiring. Where BC would look very different is those bars where the 3 public sector wages were well below zero. In BC, they'd be slightly above zero. Because in part of those contracts that were settled last year. So BC might be the only province where, in real terms, healthcare workers and teachers and government employees actually make more now than they did 4 years ago. I think maybe Quebec might be the other province, but they came close, but BC is definitely the best. That is where having a progressive government made a huge difference, undeniable.
Can you get that now?
Sorry, yes, the graph, all the graphs. Oh, the graph for BC.
It's not there for BC, yes.
Ah, okay. Orion, can you connect me with the sisters, and I'll get them the graph by email after? Okay.
If you
Okay.
email it to me, I'll just.
Or email it to you. Right. Okay. Yeah, I'll do the same numbers. It'll be easy to pull out and show you the thing. In fact, I mentioned I was talking to the teachers' unions today, and I did an interprovincial comparison, and everyone else, other than the BC people, were like, really? How did you do it?
Yes, actually, the interprovincial comparison data would be possible.
Oh, you just want the whole book, I guess, eh? There's someone over there looking for a job as an economist. You could just hire them if you'd like.
So, question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's a correlation between recession and interest rates, because I think you mentioned that inflation is still at 3.5%, but by the end of February, we could actually see a recession taking shape. If the Bank of Canada sees that a recession is taking shape, would that not start to drive interest rates down?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another really good question, and the answer is I don't know. You would think that it would, okay? You would think that if the Bank of Canada saw the economy weakening that much, they would start cutting interest rates and cut them quickly. In fact, if that was their view, they would have already been cutting interest rates a few months ago. But they are laser focused on one thing and one thing alone, and that's the inflation rate. And they have literally said, we're going to get it to 2% even if we have a recession. Now, the one possibility, it's kind of an indirect route, they believe that if we had a recession, inflation would eventually fall. So in that regard, they could say, well, we will start to go easier because we think inflation will fall. But if it doesn't, and there aren't signs that it's going to quickly, then we might not. We might be stuck with high interest rates right through a recession, which would be unprecedented.
So you can have inflation and recession at the same time?
Yes,
Okay.
you absolutely can, because the idea that inflation is caused by workers demanding too much money because the unemployment rate is too low isn't the story. That's the thing. If that was the story, then a recession should automatically solve inflation. Okay? If it was all about workers and their wages and workers having too much bargaining power because the unemployment rate is too low, just have a recession and get the unemployment rate up. On the other hand, if inflation was caused by supply chain disruptions and shortages of key commodities and pent-up demand from consumers after lockdown and world oil crises and climate disasters, right? If it's caused by all those things, we could absolutely still have inflation despite a recession. The term for that is sometimes called stagflation. The economy is stagnating but still inflating. And in that world, it isn't clear what the Bank of Canada would do. They should, if they listen to me, say, you know what? We had the story wrong about what caused the inflation. We're going to have to find another solution for inflation. And I've got 5 ideas right there, okay? And will you cut interest rates to try and get people back to work at least while we find other ways to solve inflation? That's what they should do. This crew is not going to do that. But this is where, again, we have to be prepared to call loudly for a policy that puts people and jobs and value added first through it all.
I saw that question. And by the way, I learned stagflation is a bad thing from Jim's book.
Sounds bad. Sounds good.
Yeah, I just haven't.
It's the sequel to that Stephen King novel I told you, The Economist. Then part 2, stagflation.
I just haven't heard you talk about, or the environment hasn't come up a lot, but I see it on your last slide. And just speaking of natural versus unnatural, it seems to me that an economic system that demands constant growth on a planet of finite resources is not exactly natural. So can you talk about like your understanding of what a just transition might look like? I mean, we also saw during the pandemic environmental impacts lessen, and what that looked like. There was a lot of hope during the pandemic, you know, with less cars on the road and habitats returning to, I don't know whether it was true or just Facebook algorithms, but it seemed like a hopeful time that I don't see anymore living in the shoe drop when I have to monitor air quality for my kids every year.
Yeah, right. Great question. For sure, the environment is a huge challenge, and we have to get better at protecting the environment as a goal of our economy. You know, there's often, I think, an idea that to protect the environment, we have to do less. You know, just cut back and consume less and do less and produce less. I tend to think that we actually need to do more. You know, the same rationale as I had on housing. We need to do more to protect the environment. We need to build public transit. We need to insulate buildings and build extremely energy efficient buildings. We need to roll out renewable energy systems and use them. And that involves more work, not less. So I think that the traditional view that the environment and the economy are somehow opposite is wrong. I think the reason we're in environmental trouble is we haven't paid enough attention to environmental issues as we're organizing the economy. It's more a question of what kind of economy we have rather than how big the economy is. And the lesson I would take from the pandemic was, we had a little dip in greenhouse gas emissions for a while amidst a catastrophe, but it wasn't much of a dip, and it just came back after. So imagine what you'd have to do if your solution to solve greenhouse gas emissions was shrink the economy. You'd have to shrink it 10 times more than we did during the pandemic and keep it there, and that's just not going to work. It's not going to work in terms of our ability to live, let alone politically. So I think that there is a union-friendly, worker-friendly vision for investing in sustainability that also says we need more people and more jobs to make it happen.
I'll take 2 more questions. Orange shirt, and then at the back.
Orange shirt's name is Caleb. I was just kind of curious how you thought demography played into it, because this might be completely hooey, but it seems to me that the federal government at least is trying to sustain consumer spending tax growth by bringing in immigration, right? And maybe that's wrong, but that's how I understand it. And I think one of the reasons Polyev, one of the most crass populists we've ever seen in recent Canadian history, isn't really touching it. Is because their team also recognizes that. And I think really the immigration level, because for those of you who maybe don't know, if you picture our demography, and most modern industrialized countries are also like this, it's an inverse pyramid where there's a lot more older folks and a lot fewer younger people to pay the taxes and consume the things, to pay for things like healthcare and increased demand. So that's a big problem, and there isn't, as far as I understand it, an economic model to sustain that, or we haven't figured one out. Maybe we know one, and that's going to lead to my question. My question is, what do you do when you have far too few people to pay the taxes and consume the things in our current economic model, when immigration is increasingly at risk and at risk of being scapegoated for political purposes?
Right. Okay, Kaylin, thanks. That's a very rich question. There was this idea that the baby boom is going to get old and retire, and then we're screwed. We're going to have a labor shortage. This is another rationale for a labor shortage, and we're going to have a fiscal crisis, and we're going to have an economic slowdown. And I always thought that argument was vastly, vastly overstated when we have not seen it. For sure, there's a baby boom bubble that's working its way through, but it will be a bubble, and it will eventually pass. And we've already fixed our social programs. The Canada Pension Plan, for example, is clearly fully funded through the baby boom and beyond, based on expectations about how people are going to be working and what their productivity is and their wages and so on. The labor shortage never came about because of that, and for all kinds of reasons. First of all, more older people are working longer, in some cases because they're desperate, because their pension isn't enough, but in other cases because they like to work and they're healthy and they want to keep working. So, ultimately I think that's more of a good than a bad, and there's been a huge increase in labor supply by older workers. You've had obviously an ongoing increase in labor force participation by women, and we could fix that even better with a decent national childcare program that supported women to work, and that we're sort of building right now. Lots of challenges in building it, but we'll get more labor force participation that way, and just general labor force participation has grown. So I reject the idea that we face a looming labor shortage because of demographic pressures. Why has the government responded to that argument and to other arguments by opening up immigration so much? And I think that's a good question. I don't think it's to sustain consumption or sustain growth. That's too abstract. I think it has been influenced by political pressure from employers who said this labor shortage is hurting us and we want more access to cheap labor. And the Liberals figured that was one way to do it, combined with a political judgment on their part that they wanted to be seen as the immigrant-friendly political party. And partly their goal there, I think, has been to wedge Poilievre and try to expose him and his base anyway. His base, it won't be hard. He'll be more careful as racist and anti-immigrant. There's a huge racist anti-immigrant component to the Conservative base. Poilievre is tiptoeing, and him, like Jason Kenney before him, tries to appear at the right photo ops and show that he's friendly to immigrant communities and so on. And I think the Liberals were hoping, fruitlessly, that they could smoke out Poilievre and damage him by showing that he was anti-immigrant, but they were pro-immigrant. Now I think it's backfired on the Liberals because there's all kinds of concern, even legitimate concern, not from racist people, about how this immigration thing has been mismanaged. And the government itself is now changing it. They're going to limit the number of international students who come in, and probably limit the temporary foreign worker program a bit as well. But I think their motives in a way were more crass and more concrete than a kind of a generic, we'll keep the economy going through more people. More people come, but they're not getting good jobs. They're earning low wages. They are not paying much taxes. They're obviously putting more strain on the housing crisis. So economically, it's hard to see this as a win for the economy.
And final question to that, please.
Just jumping off Christine's point about sustainability, I think these pandemic years have really raised questions about our workers' sustainability, and a lot of us are thinking about our time not working, four-day work week, flex time, all of those pieces. And I'm curious to hear about what your, if there's economic arguments that sort of support, not doing the full 5-day work week or working less because we are more productive in the hours that we are working if we were to do shorter days. And yeah, curious.
Oh, that's a great point. Thank you very much. A great note to conclude on. And this is another way that point I was making, that the pandemic changed how people think about work and how they balance their work and their life. And this is one of the reasons why, this work from home thing we have to be careful because most people could never work from home anyways. Their jobs didn't allow it. But where their jobs did allow it, once they tried it, they loved it, by and large, not everyone, and they showed that it could be done, and now they want to keep it. So at all kinds of workplaces and all kinds of bargaining tables, the right for people to at least work from home some days is a key demand, one that gets people really riled up. And I think that shows that people's assumption that you have to fit your life into your work rather than the other way around has been challenged by the pandemic. Same goes for a 4-day week or other forms of shorter work time. 4-day week isn't the only way to go. There's lots of other models for reduced work time. And that always was a traditional demand of the labor movement. From the time unions were invented, we were not just fighting for higher wages and safer workplaces, we were also fighting for time to live. And that historic progress towards shorter work time was kind of cut off by the advent of what we call neoliberalism, or the attack on workers and unions and the welfare state and so on that happened starting in the late 70s, early 80s. So we haven't made much progress on basic reduction in working time since then. And this might be a good time to revitalize that. I hope we will. We've done some work in our center, including our center has an office in Australia as well as Canada. And we've done a lot of work in Australia on the value of leisure time and trying to re-elevate demands for shorter work time as a key labor movement demand. And I think we need to.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Jim, for coming out tonight.
All right. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm honored by your attendance and also your stamina to stay through the whole damn thing. And I think the bar is still open. So there we go.
The pools are still open too. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you very much. And Jim, it's so inspiring.